Thank you for coming back to the Xanadu Review. My name is Professor John Andrews, and today with me I have John, and he's from the Medieval Mindset YouTube channel. And John is one of my favorite creators on YouTube who, as you can imagine, does a lot of interesting stuff about medieval history. But what I really like about his content is it's not as much as many of us, history buffs can really enjoy the very dry stuff. John does it in ways that are very interesting, and he also will cover it in a way that I think also makes it relevant to the modern day and the modern listener. So that having been said, John, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your channel, I guess, kind of in addition to that?
Yeah, thank you very much for the intro and the kind words. I really appreciate it. Yeah, like you said, I'm John. I run a YouTube channel called Medieval Mindset. I've been doing it for about 7 months now. Have had a long-term interest in medieval history, and yeah, just kind of figured back in January that I would start making videos talking about it. And I think the main point of my channel, is to dispel some of the myths about the Middle Ages. I think there's a lot of misinformation that still kind of gets spread, whether it's in your high school history class or on YouTube or on Reddit or anywhere else you might get your history. So I always want to be kind of entering into that narrative. And then I also talk a lot about medieval Catholicism, which I think is kind of a specific sort of subgenre of medieval history that I'm very, very interested in. So yeah, that's kind of just a little intro to me.
No, it's really great stuff. And sorry, did you say January, like as of this year?
Yeah, so I started,
Wow.
I posted my first video, January of this year, like late January.
Well, that's super impressive, man. You've really blown up in a short amount of time, and I assumed you were a lot more established and been doing this a longer time.
No, and believe me, it's been shocking to me as well. I kind of just make these videos usually every week, sometimes every other week, on topics that I find interesting or things that I encounter in my reading that I want to share with my audience. And it's been, the growth and response has been kind of shocking to me. So I don't know what to attribute that to, but.
Well, I think maybe it's just your passion and attention to detail, and sometimes, the algorithm giveth, the algorithm taketh away. But so I guess my first question to you, I have a lot of different types of people on the podcast. Kind of the same thing. I like to just follow my interest, for better or for worse. But I've had a number of people who are historians or like to write or talk about history on, because I'm a big history buff, and that's kind of part of what I write about. I have a history podcast in the works, so I'm always interested to talk to fellow history buffs. Like, what got you first interested in history, or you like the medieval period more specifically?
Yeah, I think history generally I've always been fascinated by. I don't know, it feels like this unreachable, kind of untouchable idea of what people in the past were like, and especially trying to put myself in the shoes of somebody who doesn't have the information and perspective that we have today. I don't know. It's always been something that's been a draw to me. What was important to them? What were their values? So almost like a sociological or anthropological approach to history has always been interesting to me. It was something I studied in college. I minored in history, actually medieval history, not specifically, but I took classes on medieval history, the late Roman Empire, and then a lot of 20th century, World War II, World War I history as well. But I've always been interested in that. Actually, a couple of years ago, I played a video game called Kingdom Come Deliverance, which is a medieval RPG that dives a lot into the history of the late Middle Ages, specifically in Bohemia. And that's sort of what spurred, oddly enough, this specific interest in medieval history. So always been a history fan, always been a history buff. And then this was like a few years ago, and it kicked off this absolute obsession that has culminated in this YouTube channel where I was just like, why don't I just start talking about this on the internet? And if it sucks, it sucks. And nobody that I know has to know about it. But I'm just going to start talking about these topics that are interesting to me.
Well, that's super cool. I'm glad it ended up working out for you. And I wonder if maybe it's something in the zeitgeist, because I've noticed like medieval European history and kind of like you talk about specifically re-examining Catholicism seems to be in the zeitgeist since, for me personally, I don't know, even maybe I was like, when I was a kid, I thought knights were cool, but as I got older, I was, I guess you could say, like a history hipster or something. I was like, that's, of course, that's the thing everybody's into. And I was a lot more into the Bronze Age and stuff like that. But in recent years too, have started to re-examine the medieval period for, I mean, first and foremost, like on its own merit, it's a very interesting time because, and kind of as you kind of alluded to, people are people, but the circumstances that they're in and the society they're in will influence them and make them behave in very different ways. That having been said, it's an interesting period because you see the genesis of so much of what exists now in so much of our modern world, and it's easy, I think, to underestimate that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's kind of written off. So technically the Dark Ages, and I made a video about this recently, the Dark Ages is supposed to refer to the centuries after the fall of Rome when we kind of have a dearth of written records. So that's why it's dark. It's historically dark. But it's kind of become in the cultural zeitgeist, and I think even just in casual history, this idea that extends to the whole Middle Ages. So people kind of have the Dark Ages synonymous with the entire Middle Ages, which is 1,000 years of history that happened not just in Europe, but the Middle Ages technically happened everywhere, of course. That I think has been minimized to this idea that nothing happened. If you watch too much Monty Python, you imagine it's just peasants rolling around in the mud and
hitting things with cats, all
that.
Yeah.
Bring out your dad. That was kind of the story of the whole Middle Ages, and nothing really happened for 1,000 years. So I think that's what I'm interested in. And actually, continuing along this thread of what people were like in the Middle Ages, actually kind of something that's been interesting to me, and I think actually will be the topic of my next video coming out. Well, it will be coming out next week, but whenever this goes live, it'll probably already have been posted, about if you traveled back in time and stepped out of a time machine and talked to a person, specifically in the late Middle Ages, what would that person be like, and would they like you? Would you be able to connect with them in some sort of common understanding? Would you have a cultural understanding? Let's say you understood each other's language. And there's this really interesting book, actually, it's actually a little over 100 years old, by this cultural historian, a Dutch cultural historian named Jan Huizinga, who wrote this book called The Waning of the Middle Ages. And he was kind of one of the preeminent medievalists of his era. And basically it's arguing that in the 14th and 15th centuries in England and France and the Low Countries, so basically Western Europe, it was kind of a culture of decay and decadence and overreach of the nobility, and that chivalry, this idea of knights and princesses, had actually kind of jumped off the page from storybooks and from the legend of King Arthur to real life. And these noblemen were actually kind of trying to engage in this weird romantic storybook heroic lifestyle in their own lives, and it actually influenced like political and military events in the late Middle Ages. And there have been a lot of, I mean, this is 100 years ago that this book came out, so there have been a lot of critiques of his scholarship, and I think he really is more of a storyteller than a historian. But something he talks a lot about is like what was a person like in the late Middle Ages, especially in Western Europe, and the answer is extremely emotional. If you read any of these late medieval sources, you'll notice a priest is giving a sermon and the entire church is weeping and rending their garments, and the priest can't even finish his sermon because he's crying so hard. And then everybody goes outside and takes their shoes off and walks around in procession around the town and fasts for 3 days because it's the fasting week of so and so. And so extremely religious, he paints them as extremely emotionally one way or the other. So extremely joyous or extremely sad, extremely angry or extremely happy. Like these kind of, he refers to them almost as childlike, to the point where you're reading this book and you're like, does this medieval historian hate medieval people? Which you sometimes get from some of these older historians. But it's really interesting. And like I said, there have been a lot of critiques of his scholarship, but he does use a lot of primary sources. So it's interesting to kind of go back and read what he's talking about. And you don't know how much of it's supposed to be taken seriously. I think sometimes with medieval history, it would be like if somebody in 1,000 years looked back at our history and looked at Marvel movies and was like, everybody was a superhero. Everybody thought they could fly, So it's like, how much is this really about real life? But I know I kind of just went off on a tangent there, but I just thought that was very interesting. The simplicity of life, in a way, even at the highest levels of the aristocracy. These French noblemen are getting dressed in the morning, and their servants are dressing them, and they're having them read out loud the tales of King Arthur and famous Greek and Roman heroes, because that day they want to make sure they have in mind to emulate these people. And it's really it's interesting that these men who had so much geopolitical sway are trying to be Lancelot in real life, and almost it kind of does reinforce a little bit of that childlike. I think that's a little bit devaluing the medieval mind, because there's a lot to discuss there as well. But I think that's interesting. This sort of, I know, sorry, I'm like rambling.
No, go for it.
But this kind of world that's not necessarily defined by the scientific boundaries we have now. So obviously, if you and I see an object drop to the ground, we know the laws of gravity. We know we have these kind of scientific boundaries. Even the average person knows what outer space looks like. They know, what the earth looks like from above. Like, we have these ideas that we kind of just take for granted that someone living in the Middle Ages wouldn't have, and they wouldn't have these firm scientific boundaries on their thinking. So because of that, the medieval worldview was almost slightly more dreamlike or childlike, and not in a way to reduce the medieval mind or say that they were less intelligent than us, because they weren't, but they were less informed. So if you imagine you're looking out at a forest and scientifically what makes a tree work, what photosynthesis is, what that plant is doing, whatever, and they would have an idea of that practically because they would be able to observe it, but they would look at that and think there are creatures out there, and they wouldn't have those scientific boundaries to say, like, there is no such thing as, a humanoid creature that lives in the woods. I don't know if I'm explaining this well, but they just didn't have those. Sense. Or if you're a villager and another villager tells you, hey, a guy 2 towns over can levitate, you don't have, like, there's no rule.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah,
there's no scientific rule in your mind that says, well, the law of gravity says you can't do that, and no human being has ever been observed to do that. So there's a whole thing to talk about there with medieval miracles and why people believe these things. But that's
I think it's interesting you bring that up. It's an interesting framing too, because it's I have something in the works that I'm writing right now, essentially the concept is looking at the phenomenon of conspiracy theories through kind of the lens of folklore. And one of the, minor spoilers, maybe it'll be out by the time this is released. But like, if you look at, the concept of germ theory that we understand today, you kind of alluded to, somebody could in practice understand, okay, they're not germ theory, like photosynthesis. They can understand, practically, just observing things, but they couldn't explain it. Kind of much in the same way I thought, like, if like a medieval peasant in 14th century France, they leave out a bucket of milk at room temperature, they know, okay, it goes sour, but in their mind, they're like, well, little pixies go in there and turn it sour because they're mischievous, which, like, okay, technically that's not correct, but directionally it is kind of correct, because instead of pixies, it's bacteria that do go in there. Like, they're not pixies being warded off by cold, it's bacteria, right? So I think that is something that still exists today in, like, the conspiracy theory mindset, or urban legends or what have you. I think that is a natural part of just human psychology, and it's going to express itself in different ways depending on, like, the medium of the time that you live in. Like, you mentioned superheroes, and I think, like, that probably I'd be interested to see, like, future historians and how they would interpret, like, the actions of our leaders, and maybe they would think that, like, a president or whoever is trying to emulate a superhero because that was the dominant myth of our age. But it actually kind of leads me to, I guess, one of the jumping off points, and you've kind of have already alluded to this, and I'm kind of pitching you this one essentially, but the concept of the myth of the Dark Ages, because one of my I don't know if you ever watched like any of those Nova science programs growing up, but like there was one where Neil deGrasse Tyson, what's his face? Carl Sagan was talking about, like, the concept of, we lost so much in the Dark Ages. If only it weren't for the Dark Ages, we would probably be in space right now. Which, even at I think that A shows what do they call it, Dunning-Kruger effect, where because he's really smart in the scientific field, he probably had, like, maybe a couple classes in his bachelor's in history. Like, even by the 70s, the concept of the Dark Ages was debunked. So I guess, if you want to speak on that a little, or, like I said, I kind of set you up for it, but, like, why that was the case, because I read a couple books that kind of recently that gave me some insight on it, but that seems like it's your expertise. So, like, what is the fallacy of / myth of the Dark Ages and, like, its origins?
Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot. That's a great topic. I just did a video on that 2 weeks ago, but my videos are usually 13 or 14 minutes, and I feel like I could do a whole series on that. So might have to do another one. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot to tackle there. Yeah, someone like Carl Sagan coming from the 1970s, that was still kind of a well circulated myth. I know there was a very popular book from around that era called A World Lit Only by Fire, which was kind of, I think, for a lot of people, probably the most like popular pop history book about the Middle Ages in like the second half of the 20th century. Like, for example, my mom is not necessarily a history buff, but she had that book around the house when I was a kid and would always be like, this is a good book, you should read it. It's really interesting if you like history. But if you read that book now, it's, if you go to the Wikipedia page for that book, there's a whole section on criticism, like scholarly criticism, scholarly debunking. Same with a book that I actually addressed in my second to most recent video about the myth of the Dark Ages, called The Closing of the Western Mind. And this was also a pop history book from around the same time, essentially arguing that in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, you had this influx of ideas and creativity and innovation. You had in ancient Greece, you had Alexander the Great going east and bringing these ideas with him and kind of connecting the East and West. And then all of a sudden, with the fall of Rome, we lost all these things. Europe fell apart, and somehow, for 1,000 years, the same people that had built the Roman Empire, like the same human mind of Europe and the Near East, just somehow for 1,000 years just forgot all these things and didn't really know how to put them back together. And also, I mean, this book argues too famously that Christianity is the culprit, that Christianity led to the fall of Rome, and that Christianity is the reason why nothing really advanced for 1,000 years, because it was basically like, take everything on faith, don't examine anything with science, which of course isn't true. But in terms of where this came from, obviously it didn't come from the Middle Ages themselves. And I'll talk about that in a second, but it really is more so of a Renaissance and Enlightenment idea. Basically, kind of these new eras coming about of innovation and discovery, and kind of this need for these men of knowledge, like Petrarch in the Renaissance as an example, or Voltaire in the Enlightenment, kind of needing to separate their era from this era that had come before. And especially in the Enlightenment, the big emphasis was on reason. Human reason can solve any problem. So if you look at an era like the Middle Ages that's totally defined by faith, then that would be kind of something that you would look at and say, well, that must have been a dark and ignorant time, because faith and reason, a lot of people have thought for a long time, are total opposites. So if it was an era defined by faith, like, Western Europe, medieval Christendom, Catholicism, obviously heavily defined by the church and Christian thought, it can't possibly have been a period of innovation and discovery. So that it sort of became this propaganda. And then actually in the late 1800s, it became really popular for the British gentry to get interested in medieval history. So you have a lot of, and in the early 1900s as well. So, I mean, you have famous guys in like the 30s and 40s, like C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, kind of reviving medieval thought and bringing some of this back to the forefront. And then I think now, the reason maybe why there's what you were saying about the zeitgeist and why there's some interest in my channel is there's been sort of a revival, I think, of Catholicism in the US. I've noticed it at least locally, and it seems to be happening online as well. And I think that's kind of the entry point. And then that leads people down this avenue of like, well, has everything I've been told about the history of Catholicism true? And the history of Catholicism is so closely tied with the Middle Ages that I think there's a natural pairing there. And then that opens the door for more questions about, has what I've been told about the Middle Ages was that actually how it happened? And just to tie things up, that Dark Ages myth is not accurate. There was actually, I just saw an article published the other day about some archaeological digs they're doing in northern England, and they found these iron ore, like these mines basically, and these coinage, like where they were minting coins, and it shows that more coins were minted after the Romans left, and more like the currency was more standardized after this like imperial force was removed, and local governments could actually take over and rule in an effective and localized way. And I think the issue is that we just don't have as many written sources from these time periods, so it's hard to piece together. And then we sort of fill that gap with our minds of like, well, things must have just been barbaric. If we don't have the exact facts, then things must have been barbaric. But of course, you walk into a Gothic cathedral, which is a medieval medieval building built by the medieval mind, medieval architecture, and medieval mathematicians, and you look around, and you look at the flying buttresses and the stained glass and the massive scope of these buildings, and you think, how could a backwards and simple-minded people have built something like this, or any artwork of the Middle Ages, or even any of our remaining clothing, the music that has survived, and to the point of the loss of Greek and Roman knowledge, I would like to point out that medieval monks specifically were obsessed. They were obsessed with Greek and Roman thinkers. They were obsessed with Aristotle and Pliny and all of these guys who they worshipped and did their best to preserve. Literally, some of it was just like, in the wake of the fall of Rome, libraries were burned, private collections were destroyed by invaders. So it was a lack of actual physical access, but the texts they were very, very interested in preserving. And even looking at the nobility of the late Middle Ages and scholars and monks of the late Middle Ages, you can see just like everybody had this shared cultural currency of like knowing about Aeneas and Odysseus and all these like ancient mythic historical figures and stories. So obviously these things had all been preserved, and obviously eventually led to the Renaissance as well. But there's a lot to unpack there. It's a juicy myth.
It is. That's I don't know. I would imagine, because this is in your wheelhouse. Have you read the book Dominion by Tom Holland?
No, it's on my list.
It's a really good one. That's part of what made me interested in medieval history again, just reading about that period. And like, he's one of the people who I kind of, because I'm like I guess you could say a generalist. I'm very like what's the word, like, I'm looking for eclectic with how I read about history or watch history documentaries, or channels like yours, just random things that interest me. But that part of what got me back into when he was talking about like the kind of, like you mentioned, the bias of the Enlightenment era, in particular like the Protestant Reformation and like the French Revolution, all these different things. They wanted to have this strong bifurcation. But I also wonder, and this is something that you talk about, between people wanting to return to religion. I wonder if part of it is because the modern world that we live in, like, this is another thing I'm trying to find a way to write about, how for so long, like I'd say, like, the basically since the, or at least in the Western European world, basically since the Enlightenment right up until, I would say, really, really pretty recently, like, science has been on a pedestal, and it feels like it's been, moving things forward in the right direction. And there's been, up and down with that. And there has been Luddites and whatnot. But it feels like right now we are in a pronounced downturn in trust of like science as an institution. And this is something that I've talked about before on, how to a degree, like you could say, like the institutions of science have become very cloistered and sequestered away, not unlike how, maybe people in the medieval period, in some periods, would have felt about the church, and it becomes very disconnected from reality. Like even something like technology, like smartphones, like I'm, far from the first person to say, like, was this actually a good thing? Is technology and science making our lives better? And I feel like maybe more and more people are retreating into something that's a little bit more pre-rational because of that. And kind of, in addition, this is something else you talked about, like, there's a really interesting book I read recently called Techno-Feudalism by an author called Yanis Varoufakis, which
I just did a video on that.
Yep,
that's that exact book.
Very apropos. Yeah, because we are reverting more to like a model that is more similar to feudalism in a lot of different ways, and we can dig into that. So I guess that's a lot to throw at you, but it feels like maybe that is part of the reason why this is becoming, like, medieval history and Catholicism is becoming in the zeitgeist again. People are finding more meaning in it, because I think people are just like searching for some kind of meaning in a world that, like, our traditional forms of meaning, in that more very hyper rationalist sense, are having diminishing returns for some people.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I see a lot of people talking about that in my comment section. So I definitely feel like that is something that has attracted people maybe to the kind of content that I'm making. But yeah, I think it's an interesting point. And the issue is how to express a sort of concern about like this kind of societal paradigm without coming across as anti-science or anti any of these
Agreed.
institutions, because these are all, or even anti-technology. Like these are all great things. I just did this video on techno-feudalism, and some of these people in the comments were saying, well, you know, I'd rather have a smartphone and penicillin than be a medieval peasant and, you know, die from getting kicked by my horse. And it's like, I'm not arguing, not arguing against any of that. But I do think some of these things fail to provide one of the most important kind of aspects of human life, which is meaning. People need meaning. Like science is obviously extremely important. I think some people, there was a loss in public trust maybe during the pandemic that hopefully will start to come back. And I just wonder if part of this is coming from, at least in America, I can only speak for the United States, kind of growing up in a culture that doesn't really necessarily provide meaningful answers to these questions in a way that maybe medieval society kind of naturally did, in every sort of way. And I don't know if really the answer is a reversion to the type of medieval society where religion and religious thought kind of permeates everything completely, and maybe doesn't have, at least in the life of your average medieval layperson, not as much room for scientific thought, at least not as much as there is now. So I don't think because I see that comment a lot. We need to go back to feudal, like we should just go back to regular feudalism if we're going to be in techno-feudalism, or like I would love to go back in time to a medieval village. And it's like, well, now we have the gift of hindsight. I think I just don't know if progress is always linear. And I do think sometimes we have thrown the baby out with the bathwater. Whereas we've gotten rid of some of these institutions that were useful in the past in the name of progress. So for example, like I would say, at least in the United States, like village living is kind of going by the wayside. People are becoming increasingly isolated. You don't really have these communal gatherings, like community centers are kind of falling by the wayside. The sense of connectedness in American life that was there in the past is kind of falling away. And that's something that a medieval person would have taken for granted. Your village was your lifeline. Everybody survived together. And you helped each other. It wasn't something you thought of. It wasn't something you thought of, am I isolated or am I connected? It was just life. You lived on top of each other almost. And you would be kind of shocked by the lack of privacy in medieval life, but they never knew privacy, so they never knew they were missing it. And so I think to somebody like that, you would never, if you were to pluck a medieval peasant and ask them about meaning, they wouldn't understand the question probably. They would say, well, I'm here, God has created me. This world is just a passing trial for the afterlife. You know, there are struggles and joys, and I'm part of a community. And they would understand their role as like, I'm a father and a husband and a village member, and I'm in a guild and I'm a blacksmith. Like they would understand their role in relationship with others in a way that I feel like has also kind of fallen by the wayside a little bit. But so all that to say, like, I don't necessarily think a medieval way of thinking is good or bad, but one thing I want to capture with my channel is like there are things from the past that are worth considering. Not that we should go back to the Middle Ages, which seems to be, again, like I said, what some people in the comment section think I'm advocating for, but just that we shouldn't dismiss our ancestors. Like not everything is always linear. Sometimes maybe they figured out something that we've forgotten, and that might be worth thinking about.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's something obviously you've encountered since the writing I do, I'm starting to do something explicitly like it's a history podcast I'm working on. But especially when you talk about the ancient world and say, hey, I like this aspect, that's always like, yeah, not to be rude, like, the Reddit midwit, like, well, you wouldn't have had penicillin. That's like,
right.
Yeah, no shit. I'm not making the argument that we should literally go back. But like you said, there are, I think there is wisdom to the past, and like you can't go back, even if you wanted to. I guess if you want, you could maybe convert to being Amish, which is functionally similar, but like you would have to it wouldn't really, I think, jive until it's like your kids. You would, like you said, you don't know, like you would know what you're missing if like you or I went to go be Amish, or like let's do being Amish, but for the medieval times Amish, right? Which, who knows, might exist at some point. But in any case, I think it is important to be able to look at these things in the context of the historical time that they existed in and say, hey, what was good about this? What is bad about this? And it does seem like, be it the medieval times or, I've seen jokes about like every man would give up his job to just like go be on a ship with like 20 other guys, and never, just because there is a sense of meaning there that I don't think you get from the modern world. I think that must be that's what draws me to it, because sometimes I think about that and I read about these different times, and I'll fantasize about being like, what would it be like to be living in ancient Mesopotamia and being like a Bronze Age like ingot forager, and that's your job, and thinking about having a specific place and a role in society where you don't have to think about all this stuff. And the obvious comeback is, it's good to have that freedom. It's good that we have these freedoms to do things, but at the same time, I feel like there can be kind of a malaise that comes with the lack of meaning.
Yeah, I think it's also it can be difficult. I think it's almost like we have a flood of potential meaning. Like, so for example, if you're a medieval, anybody really, a peasant, a nobleman, a king, the meaning of your life is encapsulated within the teachings of the church and kind of Christian thought. Like, you don't have a lot of options for what to choose as your meaning. That's kind of it. Your meaning is like your role in your community and your relationship with God and the church. And that's kind of your meaning. It's prescribed for you, basically. Whereas now it's like your meaning you can pursue any different avenue of, it's for you to choose. And I think it does a similar thing as our access to information, where we have just this flood of information and also way too many avenues for misinformation, but this flood of information where information becomes less valuable because you have so much of it. And I wonder if it's the same thing with meaning, where we have access to so many different avenues of meaning that eventually it kind of is just, all of it sort of loses its power or luster, because I don't know. And I wouldn't necessarily argue that it's better to have your meaning prescribed for you. And there were, of course, people in medieval Europe that didn't fit within this, Christian Catholic thinking. I mean, basically anybody who's in any Jewish community would have suffered greatly during a lot of the great purges of the Middle Ages, which happened pretty regularly, at least throughout Western Europe. There were, if you were gay, if you were kind of outside of anything of the framework of what would be expected of you as a good Christian man or a good Christian woman, it wasn't going to work out for you very well. So there are things to think about there. So, I mean, there's a lot of trade-offs, but all that to say that I sometimes wonder if it's the same thing as the flood of information, where if you have all these different options for meaning, then you almost have none. It's been cheapened.
I would agree. And I think that's an important thing to state. It wasn't a perfect world by any means. It's not about the specificity to me as much as it is the context. We have people who are outside of society now, and I think, unfortunately, at least, this is just maybe me being cynical in my observation, is like most people, some people I think that's great for, and it's interesting. I've heard it described as like, it's great if you have that level of, what's the word I'm looking for? Agency, either like with you as a person, if you're a really driven individual, or if you have the means to do so. You're almost living like an aristocrat. But I think a lot of people live kind of a peasant lifestyle by default, which instead of, you would have a community to fall back on and religion. I say this as somebody who's not personally a Christian, but just seeing like, most people today, I think, just default to like some sort of consumerist hedonism, which is, is it better? Is it worse? I mean, I think it's a difficult question to answer, but I think it's an important one to ask. So I was going to ask you something about that, but maybe it'll come to me in a second. But any thoughts on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, that just kind of shook loose the concept of community. I know I touched on the medieval village and kind of the village ecosystem and how important it was to like the medieval psyche and how a medieval identity, how you would see yourself. But if you ever watched, sometimes in medieval movies or TV shows, there will be somebody who's on trial. They're on trial for something, and they have the option of either being put to death or being exiled. And of course, like us watching it with our modern perspective, would say, take the act. Like, why would you ever? But it's presented as like a difficult choice, and it's never really explained why it's so difficult. But something that's important to remember is that in these medieval communities, that was your lifeline in a way that once you were separated from that, you were basically as good as dead. because you were born and raised in this community, everybody knew you, you were kind of a vital part of it, and let's say you had committed some crime or some offense against the community, which is why medieval justice was taken extremely seriously, because if you think of the community as a unit of survival, like we're all working together so we can survive, we can get to the harvest, we're not gonna starve this winter. So if somebody's acting in an antisocial way, if somebody's acting in a way that goes against the community, then they need to be brought to justice. And I think sometimes medieval justice can seem very harsh or very almost silly to us, these like trials by combat and things they were doing. But if you look at it through that lens, it makes a little bit more sense of why they took it so seriously. But it also meant that your community was extremely important. So if you were separated from your community, so let's say I get booted from my village and I travel to the village, 10 miles down the road, they're going to ask why. And so they're not going to accept me either. And then you're exiled. And so it's almost like seen as like a living death, which just goes to show, I know there's that famous saying, no man is an island. I think in our modern conception, we kind of think of ourselves as these islands. We're very self-involved, very self-obsessed. And I think our culture, which you were talking about, that consumerist hedonism, encourages that sort of self-obsession, self-thinking. What do I need to buy so I feel better, so I can do this, so I can reach that? And just a medieval person wouldn't necessarily have thought in that way, which had other consequences, because it also meant you weren't thinking in a way of social mobility. Like a medieval peasant would never have been thinking to themselves, and I know this sounds like a blanket statement, but it's basically true. Like, how do I advance? How do I get rich? Like, how do I advance? Because they lived in this concept of like an ordered universe, meaning if you were born a peasant, it's because that God intended you to be a peasant, which of course, not necessarily the best way to think, but it does, sort of provide this idea of like, well, I'm going to be as good of a person as I can in my community and support the people around me, because it's not about me. Like, God made me the way he made me. I'm not trying to get rich. I'm not trying to, but that had its own set of consequences as well. But it's just kind of an interesting, not necessarily we should hearken back to that, but it's just an interesting way of thinking, a more selfless way of thinking, much less self-obsession.
Yeah. And that's kind of what my takeaways. I'm definitely, I have a podcast, I have a blog, I work in the tech world for a living. I'm not, I'm not like a Ted Kaczynskiist, I'm not trying to go live in a cabin, right? I like to live around people, and all these things are good. That having been said, I think it also speaks to, and if you want to expand on this, people have a lot of misconceptions about that era as well, because there's this idea that like people back then were essentially slaves, but it was a very and I think maybe that's some of these like more modern thinkers, like I don't know if you've seen like people who are like, we should reestablish monarchy and feudalism formally.
I say that a lot.
Yeah. Well, it's not something I agree with necessarily, but I do understand, at least intellectually, where it's coming from. If you, at least, you obviously understand this better than I do, and you can explain it to the audience. But feudal society was probably, European or Japanese, what have you, probably, and I say this without a value judgment, other than maybe hunter-gatherer, like the most stable human society that has ever existed, just based on metrics, because there was a certain amount of reciprocity that existed between the peasants, the lord, the clergy. It was a self-contained system, for better or for worse, and as you mentioned, often for worse, as much as for better. But I think that's something that maybe people don't understand, if you want to speak a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest misconceptions about feudalism, and again, this comes from, if you ever watched like Braveheart or like Monty Python, you just like Prima Nocta in Braveheart, like these abuses of the nobles on the peasantry, and they just squashed them and they had no rights. And so I think that's where a lot of this popular conception comes from. But the big difference between feudalism and something that we find ourselves entering into now, like a techno-feudal system, is that as if you were a peasant, your lord owed you something as well. It was a mutual exchange. A lot of the feudal system didn't happen on paper. It wasn't documents being drawn up. It was verbal agreements between a peasant and the Lord allots you this land, and you say, I'm going to farm this land, and I'm going to take some of the crops for myself to feed my family. But, let's say 70% of them go to you, and that's kind of my tax to you. But if raiders come to the land, if an enemy army comes to the land, you'll fight for me. And if there's a war happening elsewhere that needs to be fought, you'll go fight for me. So the nobility fights, the clergy pray and the peasants work, and that's kind of the makeup of medieval society. And what you say about like feudalism being one of the most stable kind of systems in human history, it is an interesting point to make, that it lasted for about 1,000 years, which is longer than most other kind of forms of social or economic organization.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to question if it was so like the human spirit has a tendency to have a limit, like a limit of oppression, at which point, like, we will go no further and we rise up and we must revolt and rebel. And in the Middle Ages, you don't necessarily start to see that happening until the very end of the Middle Ages, almost early Renaissance, when the abuses of the nobles and the abuses of the king have kind of gone too far. You see the peasants revolt in England. You see the revolt of the Jacquerie, who were it's a peasants revolt happening in France, and sort of these sort of proto-Protestant ideas kind of spreading as well, that are fueling this. And then someone like Martin Luther is coming along and saying, like, yes, keep rebelling, keep slaughtering. You know, there's a lot to unpack there. Those things are very much tied together, but it does make you wonder, like, if feudalism was so bad, why did it last for so long? And again, a system based on honor primarily. We have this agreement. It's not necessarily written down anywhere, but I've agreed to it as your lord. You've agreed to it as the peasant who's working the land. You know, under certain circumstances, you can be freed. You can buy your freedom. There were a million different circumstances in which you could be free. And also, I think when we hear the word peasant, we think of somebody who's almost slave-like, tied to the land, and they could never leave. But actually, like, the peasant was a diverse kind of group of people. There were some peasants who were tied to the land, but there were plenty of free peasants who had their own property. But that's just the only way to classify, because they were like agrarian. They were basically farmers. So they weren't city dwellers. They weren't burghers. They weren't nobility. They weren't clergy. They weren't, involved with the royalty at all. So they kind of get put into this category of peasant, but they're not peasant as we think of them. So all of that to say, the feudal system is a lot more diverse than we think it is, and there's a lot of people who don't fit into the categories, because you'll see like king, nobles, clergy, peasants, and that's the feudal system. And it's like, well, they're city dwellers or burghers. In the late Middle Ages, there were rich merchants and guildsmen. There were all kinds of people who didn't fit into this like strict kind of pyramid of medieval society. And I think that diversity of feudalism is also sort of what helped it survive for so long. And also this idea of an ordered universe, of like, this is how it is, this is how it always has been. And I mean, I don't know, if you're living through like a turbulent time and you have this system of organization that's working, I would wonder, because if we're thinking about these peasants' revolts that happened in the late Middle Ages, it's happening in the aftermath of the Black Death. And I think once you've experienced like an extinction event like that, you start thinking, what do I have to lose? So these peasants' revolts become much more common. People start thinking about their rights a lot more. You know, if you've ever met somebody, or if you yourself have ever had like a near-death experience or a medical emergency, and it makes you start thinking about your life in a different way, sort of like that. And also, of course, with the Black Death, there's a labor shortage in Europe, and all of a sudden the peasants have leverage. And that leads to a lot of interesting conversations about what does your noble blood really mean? So.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very interesting way of looking at it. Again, like I say, stability, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good thing, but I think maybe that's why people look at the society that we live in now, and there's just this great sense of precarity that so many people feel, like spiritually, politically, as far as your identity goes. And I also wonder, maybe that's why we're a part, again, why the reason we're seeing this become popular again is, like, I've read various writers saying like the nation state is potentially going away, and that's we're reverting to like either a soft feudalism or federalization. And again, that's just because if you look at, kind of like you talked about with the Black Death, and then advances in technology, that's where you see like nationalism and nationalist movements started to try to fill that void. Like, okay, we don't have this social and political order that existed before. Well, then who are we? And it's like, well, is it a language? Is it a region? And now those things are starting to make, less and less sense in the modern world. So it'll be very interesting to see how things shake out. And, there's a part of me that's very, I feel like I'm kind of by disposition, I'm kind of a cynical person. And I just I assume like it's going we're all going to be, it'll be like either Lord Musk or Lord Bezos or you know whomever, right? Whatever billionaire, and you're one of these guys, fiefdoms, and it's of course, Lord Bezos watches over us, and we don't get to go outside past 3 o'clock, and we all have to work in the Amazon warehouse. But the dental's not bad, all things considered. So, because it'll be interesting to see how things shake down in that sense.
Yeah, and I think one of the, I guess, not to fearmonger, but one of the scary things, especially, I talked about this in the video comparing kind of feudalism and techno-feudalism. And in the video, I'm not intending to paint feudalism in a positive light, but I am saying that the powers of a feudal lord were quite limited. I mean, he didn't have, like someone like a Jeff Bezos or an Elon Musk has these platforms that connect billions of people. They have surveillance on a mass scale. They have, like, I don't think a lot of people realize, because people in the comment section of that video were saying, well, this doesn't really affect me because I don't make my money online. So why do I care what these guys are doing? Just delete social media off your phone. But I don't think people realize it permeates into every aspect of your life. And until you kind of start to notice how much, even if it's not Facebook or Instagram, how much your, the software that your company uses to pay your paycheck, like Venmo, Uber, Lyft, you don't realize how involved your life is in these technologies.
Banking is pretty much entirely digital.
Oh, exactly. That's a great example. Exactly. Something that the medieval mind couldn't have really conceived. A level of power that any medieval king would have salivated over and could not have even imagined. But there's not only that. In the Middle Ages, there was, at least for a peasant, a concept of something called the commons, which is like shared land and shared tools and shared things that are just for the peasants. The Lord doesn't own them. We kind of communally own this plot of forest that you can hunt in, and this plot of land that's for everybody. And also, you own part, like the Lord is giving you the land, but you own part of that land to farm for yourself, and he can't mess with that, at least theoretically. So we don't really have a digital commons or a sense of commons anymore. These things that we just kind of communally own, and the government or Jeff Bezos or our techno-feudal lords can't mess with. Like, it's sort of a level of control and entrenchment in our lives that the medieval mind couldn't have comprehended. So it looks a lot like feudalism, except I would argue, at least
without the good parts.
Yeah, without the good parts, without the obligation from your lord to you, because why would Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos owe you anything? Or they might throw you a bone, like you said, a little bit of dental, maybe you have air conditioning. Why do you care that you have to work in the Amazon warehouse? At least it's it's, with global warming, it's 1,000 degrees outside, but at least you get to be in this cool warehouse working all day. Like, we'll throw you that bone. So yeah, it's interesting. And I mean, final point about the peasants' revolts, like, that's something that a lord has to keep in mind as well, because a lot of his military comes from levies from the community. So like, people have to come fight for him. So that's like having your own military rise up against you, or he has to use foreign mercenaries to put down these revolts. And that takes time and money to get that together. So the peasantry actually had a power in that way. Like, if we can all band together and organize and get our scythes and sickles, like, he really has a reason to be afraid of us in a way that Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or, an American president who has control of a 21st century military has no reason to be afraid of the populace, because we can't really rise up in any meaningful way.
Yeah, and kind of like you said, there's there's like a lack of reciprocity. I remember, I don't know if you've heard of, there's an author called Jaron Lanier who wrote a really interesting book called Who Owns the Future? And he kind of talks about, like, in addition to like the digital commons, about like the idea of how our data is something that's very valuable, but we have no ownership of it, even though like it is so valuable to these companies. We don't make any money off of. He's proposed like a digital bill of rights, which, let's be real, probably never going to happen. But I think you've really hit the nail on the head. Like, I think, and again, maybe that's part of the reason the taboo existed against, banking in the medieval era, is because there's something that is just kind of socially maladaptive about it. And much in the same way that like your digital footprint can be it your ability to bank or do business, and that's something that I think is only going to increase. And it's not an easy thing to opt out of, unless you go like full Ted Kaczynski and go live in the woods somewhere. Then you have to be a part of this system to some degree. And I don't know, this is, I don't know how into the tech side of things you are. So, if this is way off of your base, feel free to tell me. But I've heard about talk of like a de facto balkanization of the internet, just because it's getting a little bit too out of scope, and like really like this is probably something that's socially maladaptive, to like, you know, see what's going on in other countries with no ability to change it. Like kind of talking about if you were to like try to take a medieval person and put them in the modern world, like, you know, they go insane for a lot of different reasons. But, you know, of course, like, you know, maybe prima nocta or like abuses of power existed, but unless it happened to you or somebody you knew, you weren't aware of it. And now we're aware of like every single injustice and every single abuse of power. And I think that's probably what's driving people so crazy right now.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I read a book recently. I wish I could remember what it was called, but it's about how these social media algorithms work and kind of how these different platforms rose to power in our modern world and how much power and sway they have, and giving kind of all these examples of revolts and revolutions and conflicts that have happened all over the world, basically from Facebook and from Instagram, especially like third world countries that are given internet access, and then sort of this Facebook is treated as like a trusted conduit of information, which it also is in the US, unfortunately. And it becomes this really easy avenue to spread misinformation, which can lead to ethnic cleansings and like wide scale social revolutions and things like that. And I do think social media taps into, or just tech and technology in general, in some ways, is advancing much faster than our brains have evolved. Like we're still in a hunter-gatherer brain. We still have that. So
we're not meant for this dopamine feedback loop and like constant fight or flight. Our monkey brains are not meant for this, what we're doing.
Right. And I mean, obviously these algorithms are powered by artificial intelligence and machine learning. So they're basically learning, they're teaching themselves, and it's gotten to the point where the developers at these social media companies can't even like pop the hood to like they don't even understand what the algorithm is doing at this point. Like it's beyond the scope of what's kind of understandable in terms of the direction it's going. And from what I understand, obviously it's not like a human brain. So it's not, the algorithm doesn't care whether you like about whether the content makes you happy or the content makes you angry, but it will pick up on the fact that you watch longer when it makes you angry. You watch longer when it makes you sad and concerned, even if it's something happening on the other side of the world. So it serves you more of that content, even though it's not a human being on the other side of the screen making that decision to serve you more of that content. The algorithm is just noticing your numbers are going up. The watch time is going up if it serves you more negative content, which obviously creates this sort of negative feedback loop and this impression that the sky is falling and the world is in a worse state than it's ever been, which a peasant in the 15th century would have laughed at in the wake of the Black Death and wars that destroyed, you know, the continent and, you know, all these things. And also climate change. I don't think a lot of people know that climate change was happening in Europe. The world was heating up, and that led to a lot of crop failures and famines in the late Middle Ages. Interestingly, this is getting totally off topic, but you said your audience has some ADD tendencies, so maybe this will be good. There was something called the medieval cooling period from about 900 to 1200 AD, where things cooled down a few degrees, at least in Europe, for a variety of reasons. And it got to the point where they were able to grow wine in England, which now is laughable. The medieval warm period, my bad. Mm-hmm. Things warmed up a couple degrees in a good way. I'm thinking the opposite in both ways, but all of that to say, crops were grown easier. A lot of advancements happened between 900 and 1200 AD because less famine, crops grew easier, the climate warmed up, the soil was more fertile, wine was being grown in England, and then the great cooling happened in the late Middle Ages, and that led to a lot of famines. It led to years of like insane snowfall, and that influenced all these social changes as well. But to your point about the medieval mind, they would have conceived of the world as pretty much to the horizon. You know, like your community, your village, what's going on with you. So if you were to ask an English peasant, like, oh, have you heard what's going on in, you know, the Holy Roman Empire, unless for some reason it affected them. Although, interesting point on that as well, especially in the late Middle Ages, like if we're just talking about England, France, you know, the Low Countries, pretty much everybody would have known a veteran of a foreign conflict. Like you would know somebody in your village who had fought in the 100 Years' War, or you would know somebody in your village, I mean, especially in late medieval, even early Renaissance England, who had fought in the Wars of the Roses. You know, your neighbor would walk with a limp because they got hit with an arrow on a French battlefield, and they could tell you what France was like. So I think a lot of people assume medieval people had these small, closed minds and didn't know about the world, but like they traveled, they got around. But yeah, this idea of like a medieval person being upset because of something happening on the other side of the world. It's like they wouldn't have.
Yeah, it's I do wonder if, because I'm sure you're aware of like the Dunbar number of like the human mind, like I don't know if it was a sociological study or like a neurological thing. Like we're only programmed to be able to really deal with so many people. Like it's like 103 or something like that. I don't know how true that is in a practical sense, or like in a literal sense, but in a practical sense, it does feel very real. And I feel like the farther away I get from, because it's one of those things that's a double-edged sword. Is that I'm sure you can imagine as somebody who's into history, we don't have to get into it, but I would imagine you also have an interest in politics. Those two things tend to go hand in hand, and it's one of those things where like it's a double-edged sword. Like on one level, you want to stay informed, but on another level, it's like, well, there's literally nothing I can do about this. There's horrible things happening on the other side of the world, and it's just driving me crazy. And I think that I think that's part of the reason why you see so many people going crazy, becoming mass shooters and whatnot. That's it's obviously a very complicated topic, and I don't want to say one to one it's this, or some people say SSRIs, the internet, whatever. There's a lot of factors, but I think there is something to be said, looping back again to having a smaller horizon, at least to like operate from. It's okay to go outside of it, but like maybe, because at least for me, because you're on YouTube, you're one of the channels I actually subscribe to, and I went in YouTube settings, I uninstalled the app, and I turned off suggested videos, which is it's very interesting to see how your brain chemistry changes and how, because like I pretty much not to blow smoke up your ass, so to speak, but like you, or like I'm sure you've heard of somebody like Tasting History with Max Miller, who does great historical food content, or Feral Historian, who I've had on this channel before. Like it's like, oh, I want to go to this video from this person specifically at this time instead of ambient consumption, which it feel I don't think it's exactly like the most groundbreaking thing to say. Like this is not a healthy thing to be into, just as far as like your brain chemistry goes. And it kind of made me think of something you said as far as the algorithm is like now determined by AI and machine learning, and maybe like if, like you said, if they try to go under the hood, they can't even figure out exactly what's going on, other than more, the longer your eyeballs are with it, the more betterer it is for them, right? And this is probably not a good thing long term. I do sometimes wonder, like, are we going to look back on this like the way that we look now on like people in the 50s smoking a pack a day? And maybe like the silver lining to me is between the interconnected nature of social media, people already seem like they're starting to pull back into specific communities, as well as like as you're probably aware, like the concept of systems collapse between like the Bronze Age collapse, when like one or two things went wrong and the whole Mediterranean Bronze Age society collapsed, or with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and all the which as we discussed, it's a myth, but like the myth of the Dark Age, because that's like the post-Roman Empire era where like these places had to like, okay, we don't have this central authority from Rome, from the church or the legions, we kind of have to make it our own. I kind of wonder if that's what we're going to see, both in terms of like the internet and like society more broadly, because that does seem to be a trend that I see more and more, people wanting to become more communitarian and more local, across the board, left, right, just total normies. And maybe that's a good thing. I hope so. Just because, and again, to kind of loop back to the beginning, the medieval world at the very, if not like a one-to-one, we need to go back to this. That's at least a model to work with, because there's obviously, as you said, medieval Europe, but across the whole world, you could look for your own cultural specificity and maybe do a la carte and find something that's going to work better for this different paradigm.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, I think there's a lot we can take from the medieval way of living, because it's not a lot of the best things about medieval living aren't necessarily specific to the Middle Ages. They can actually still be seen in some like small scale agrarian communities today that haven't really been hit as hard by industrialization, where people sort of live in a way that's more dependent on each other. It's more community oriented. Like I said, I think one of the biggest tragedies of modern American life is death of village culture, death of knowing your neighbor and having community events and third spaces and places where you can go and freely exchange ideas. And I think it creates this situation where, especially a lot of young people, their world is not the world around them, the world in their neighborhood. Like there's a lot less local thinking. I think there's mostly global thinking, which can be bad in the way that it paralyzes you and makes you unable to act. This flood of information, of news in all these places that you're never going to go to and have never been to, whereas your own neighborhood, there are things happening and you aren't stepping outside because your whole world is happening digitally. And I think especially for young people can lead to this cycle of like extremism, algorithm fed extremism, where it's showing you more and more shocking content that's, you know, taking you down a certain path, whichever direction of, you know, and then it becomes, especially when you're young and your brain is kind of more sort of flexible and willing to kind of take on new information, it can become very, very damaging, as we've seen. But I actually feel like we're kind of moving back towards the worst parts of the Middle Ages just sort of naturally now. I mean, we talked about techno-feudalism. So the worst abuses of the feudal system are kind of starting to rear their head again. I mean, certain trends that are happening all over the world, authoritarian rule, the you know, kind of extreme violence becoming normalized in society in a way that it hasn't been in centuries, wide conflicts in the like if you kind of think of this idea of the fall of Rome, like this big central power starting to crumble, and now you see the world getting a little bit more violent. You see more conflict happening on the edges of the empire, and these things you see in the fall of Rome. And I feel like it's a cheap analogy that I see a lot of like modern social historians make about like America is Rome and the fall of America is the fall of Rome. But
there's some there though.
There is something there. But it's interesting to think about. You know, we kind of look at where we're heading as a society, but that can be troubling. But I think the good part about it is that for as much misinformation as can be spread on the internet, people can get really good information and find communities that are, you know, that they fit into. And I think people are starting to also recognize like, this is not sustainable. I'm not like I spend 4 hours on TikTok and I'm not feeling better afterwards. Like I'm not feeling mentally good afterwards. So maybe it would be a better idea to delete TikTok and, you know, go outside and join a club or something. I don't know. I hope young people are thinking that way. It seems like they are.
At the very least, and this is, you know, I haven't done any in-depth research on this, but just anecdotally from what I'm hearing, there are some people who are super into TikTok and whatnot, but it also seems like these smaller digital communities like Discord servers and what have you seem to be, which, you know, it seems like we're probably around the same age. So you maybe remember, I don't know if that was your world at the time, but like the pre-social media internet where it was forums and like you had like weird little message boards with like 80 people who had its own, you know, its own little quirky culture. And maybe that'll be a good transitionary period. Because then again, like I do, and it's very easy, especially if you're like somebody who speaks publicly in any capacity, or if you like history and politics, to like have these broad sweeping generalizations that I think usually aren't correct. That having been said, I see like, you know, within our lifetime or maybe the next generation, it's going to be like, wow, people used to be on social media and on the internet all the time, and people have moved away from it, or, you know, Lord Bezos, Musk, whomever will have put the chip in our brain by then, one of the two. But one of the last things I wanted to talk to you about is, because I think this kind of ties it all together really well, is with the interest in the medieval world more broadly and people wanting to find meaning and I get, you know, something higher to aspire to than just consumerism or national identity, what have you. We talked about the resurgence of religion, and we're seeing like the Catholic Church having a big moment right now in the United States, which, because, you know, we're not a traditionally Catholic country, like Orthodox Christianity is having a moment. Christianity, I've seen like, you know, there's like a resurgence like people becoming more religious in like Judaism or Islam as well, whatever your thing is. But I'm curious, like specifically, I want to talk about the Catholic Church because I feel that's another one of those things that I think there's just a lot of misconceptions about. And I guess I want to hear your perspective on because I feel like a lot of people, like we're raised, at least for me, I guess you could say I'm agnostic now. I was raised religiously, but I went through my edgy atheist fedora phase, as I think many of us who
Same
grew
here.
up in the 2000s did.
Yeah.
Where like the Catholic Church was like the arch bad guy of history. If it weren't, because I remember Neil deGrasse Tyson did a I guess remake of the Carl Sagan Cosmos series, and I remember watching it, and like there are these like cartoons of like the scientific figures from history in the medieval period, and the Catholic Church was always the bad guy. But it was very interesting, the tone of it, because it almost felt like, and again, I don't know your background, but for me, I grew up religiously, and we would watch these like cartoons of Bible stories that were like morality tales for children. The Bible stories were, I don't want to say dumbed down, but
Veggie Tales.
Not quite Veggie Tales, but like cartoons of the Bible.
Yeah.
But Veggie Tales is not that far off, but that's kind of what I would see, like these very simplified, moralized tales of Locke and Hobbes or stuff like that. And the one that really struck me was the tale, the story of Galileo, which is like one of those ones that everybody knows. That as you probably obviously know, like the story, like it's like, oh, Galileo was, it's usually burned at the stake, but it was like, well, he was put under house arrest essentially, which I'll let you tell the story because you probably know it better. But it was not that simple. It was like the scientific consensus was way past. It was like Galileo was. It was like a point of technicality of like how I forget exactly what it was when I read it, and if you could probably tell it better. But to me, the funniest part of it was that Galileo wrote, like the Pope was actually a supporter of Galileo, and then he wrote like this satirical piece where he made a character based off the Pope and called him like Simplicico or something, or did like basically the Virgin versus Chad type of thing. It's like, all right, well, you pushed the Pope too far, man. So all that to say, my trademark winded question of like some of these misconceptions about the Catholic Church and the social role that it played, I think that is kind of very misunderstood.
Yeah, I think there's so much to unpack there, and this is one of my favorite topics for sure. I mean, dude, Neil deGrasse Tyson, where to start there? I mean, I don't know the guy personally. I'm sure he's a wonderful guy, but I've just seen so much of his content and so much content from his ilk of like, obviously he's in the he's in the scientific realm, but he's part of that like new, like Christopher Hitchens, like a new atheist kind of agenda, which seems like obsessed with making you believe that like the universe is a meaningless void. You're an accident, like a random accident of like, basically there's a 1 in a billion chance and somehow the earth ended up here and none of it means anything. It's not going anywhere and it didn't come from anything. And it's just like this obsession with stripping away meaning, because we're talking about meaning. And there seems to be this obsession with stripping away meaning. And I think a lot of people, where this resurgence is coming from, is a lot of people looking around and being like, but I see meaning all around me. There's inherent meaning in life. So how could I believe this? Because the sort of this new atheist, I mean, it's not even new anymore. Like you said, like early 2000s, 2010s, like when we were growing up, it was popular. Like a sort of agenda. It is its own religion. It's its own belief system. To believe that everything was an accident and came from nothing and there's no higher intelligence, that is a system of belief in its own way. But all that to say, I also wonder too, and I'll get to like the Catholic Church as a medieval institution, but like with younger people now, especially, a lot of them aren't turning to like evangelical Christian churches. They're turning, like you said, to Catholicism, like the Catholic Church or Orthodoxy, like these traditional historical Christianity. And I do wonder almost in a way if it's like, that's like kind of the last way to rebel. Like, it's not rebellious anymore to dye your hair or get piercings or to live any kind of alternative lifestyle. Like to become an Opus Dei Catholic is like the most rebellious thing you could do, because your friends are kind of probably going to be like, what the, we're accepting of everything, but not that. Like, that's the one thing we don't accept. So I think people see it as rebellious, young people. But it's an interesting perspective for me too, because I like you, I wasn't raised Catholic. And especially spent my teenage years, atheist, agnostic, didn't even really think about the question much. And then kind of came to it as an adult through just a variety of things that had happened in my life and observing the world around me and kind of the lack of meaning in society. And, ended up becoming Catholic. And that's obviously influenced a lot of my content. But I think to speak to the Galileo story, it's like a little bit outside of medieval history. I've wanted to like reference it in my channel before, but essentially, yes, that the church didn't have any interest in suppressing scientific discovery. They actually financed a lot of it. Some of our most foundational scientific discoveries were discovered by monks and priests. The Big Bang Theory, the periodic table of elements, Galileo was supported by the Catholic Church as well. So the church, the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages and Renaissance sees the universe as God's creation, God's beautiful creation, and our duty as human beings to understand that universe. We're the stewards of creation. God has created us to have dominion over this world, so it's our duty to understand this world as best we can. So they weren't really interested in standing in the way of that, especially in the late Middle Ages. The Catholic Church was also obviously a political entity, and that's kind of where, this is much later, but Galileo is kind of running afoul of the Pope in that capacity, like challenging his authority. So that's it. It still isn't great. Still not a great look for the church, but like doesn't really have anything to do with faith standing in the way of reason or faith standing in the way of scientific progress, which I think still people see it that way. And I think there are a lot of fundamentalist Christian evangelicals in the US who paint a bad picture of Christianity and like a caricature of it that turns a lot of people off who don't, all they know about Christianity are the crazy, I don't know if you remember when we were younger, I don't know if they're still around, Westboro Baptist Church. How they
yeah.
Like that's what a lot of people think of when they think Christianity. Like they would go like protest military funerals and things like that. And
I feel like it's redundant in the age of internet and online trolls. Like
I know. Yeah. But it just, they gave the whole thing such a bad name. And I think that, of course, like creating a paradigm like that makes it easy to slot in the Catholic Church as the villain. And then also like, I'm not trying to get too conspiracy minded here, but America is a Protestant country, and a lot of our public education has in the past been decided by like Protestant sources. Like that's like, I specifically remember in high school having lessons about the evils of the Catholic Church. Even though I went to a public I went to public school, it was bizarre. Like in retrospect, it was kind of this bizarre narrative being pushed that nobody seemed to think was weird. Like you said, the villains of history. Like they told everybody the earth was flat, even though everybody in the Middle Ages knew the earth was round. That was known in antiquity and preserved in the Middle Ages. All these crazy things about the universe. The Catholic Church was actually very interested in cosmological observation and astronomical observation. And actually, weirdly enough, a lot of people in the Middle Ages were really into astrology, and a lot of medical practices.
Also big now.
Yeah, also big now. A lot of medical practices in the Middle Ages were tied in with astrology. Like your humors might be imbalanced because of what's happening in the sky right now. And the Catholic Church didn't really, the cool thing about Catholicism historically is that the Catholic Church has never thrown anything away. Like over the course of 2000 years, they've absorbed all these different, I talk about this in my video about medieval paganism. They've absorbed all these different traditions and cultures and ideas, even something in the Middle Ages, like astrology, which you would think the Catholic Church would frown on that. They were just kind of like, all right, like that's cool. Like we're into it too, whatever. Yeah. And so one of the things that attracted me to Catholicism is like this rich 2,000-year intellectual history that I'm not going to, like, obviously the Catholic Church persecuted, obviously the Catholic Church oppressed. This is not arguable. That's a fact. But in the grand scope of history, I feel like has been much more of a source of good. The establishment of hospitals and like healthcare and universities and literacy and like alternate career paths for like intelligent young people and opportunities for independence for women, which was like unheard of in the Middle Ages, unless you were a nun in a convent, in which case you could actually run your own business and farm and like have your own kind of mini village of other women you lived with. And it was pretty much one of the few opportunities for women to have independence and have like financial stability on their own in the Middle Ages was provided by the church. Like very progressive and forward thinking in a lot of ways that are kind of written off. And I think kind of tying into what my channel is all about, I just feel like it's very reductive to say like 1,000 years of history is all this or all that, or this is the narrative.
Well, it's one of the things that like again, when I was an edgy atheist and more like, for me, like, history was like, I think when a lot of young people get into history, it's like, it's ancient Rome, Egypt, World War II. But the more you get into it, you are confronted with um, how much granularity there is to stuff like that. Because yeah, you could say like yes, because that's the Catholic Church oppressed. Like I think a lot of like the modern, which I guess is a side tangent. I wonder if part of the reason why the Catholic Church is held up as like this bad guy of history, even like mainstream um, U.S. schools, is because, like you said, it hits both veins of the American culture war. That's still very conservative, very Protestant leaning, which is very downstream from being anti-Catholic, and the more liberal social justice left. Like they both, those streams that very rarely cross end up crossing there. But all that to say, I think that is like there's this myth like, oh, it's all this evil stuff, which yes, there's bad things, but also it was like essentially a branch of the government for a long time, and it was a brutal time to exist. And I think all that having being said, I do think that at the very least you have to look at the Catholic Church in historical context, at least in the medieval sense. I don't want to touch some of the modern controversies because that'd be its whole own video.
Yeah.
But it's and I think it's also interesting, just kind of like a tangent as well, and maybe that'll be something we can incorporate into a more modern spiritual practice. Maybe again that's why the Catholic Church is a little bit more resilient ultimately than some of these other forms like Protestantism, because I don't know if that's just something you follow, but I see like sometimes online, people are like more pagan or type people like, oh, Christianity destroyed Rome, or our proud European pagan tradition was ruined by this weak Christianity. It's like, have you read an actual history book? Do you know how like profoundly first Greek and then Roman for like the first couple 500 years of the Catholic Church was? Like, this is a profoundly Western Greek and Roman tradition. Like, you can't separate the two. So I don't know, I think maybe that'll be interesting to see if Catholicism can continue to integrate these outside sources. Because one more thing, and I'll throw it back to you. I find it interesting that in some ways the Catholic Church, I think, is more agile than people give it credit, because one of my favorite anecdotes is when Catholicism was being brought to the New World in South America specifically, it just wasn't taking until the priest there they played up the Virgin Mary, because in the indigenous South American traditions, like the divine feminine was a huge part of their tradition, and to cut that out, it was essentially a non-starter for them. But to integrate the Virgin Mary and have that divine feminine, it was able to take then, and like South America is kind of like the stronghold of Catholicism now. It's like one of the few strongly Catholic places in the world now. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves in the future.
Yeah, I mean, well, a couple interesting things. One interesting thing, and I saw this in my video about medieval paganism, is, I got a lot of modern pagans commenting about, Christianity taking away ancient pagan traditions and how they're trying to bring back these ancient pagan traditions. But if you look at the history of paganism in Europe, which it wasn't one thing, it's just any religion that wasn't Christianity, the greatest pagan tradition is converting to Christianity. So if you really want to get in touch with your pagan ancestors, that's really the way to do it. But it's interesting what you say about the church's flexibility. I think one of the things they learned early on, I think just Christianity in general, is you have to meet people where they are. You can't come in as this, like, if you're a new kind of religious and social force coming into a region, coming into a society and a culture, you can't like wipe everything away and say everything that you're doing and all of your traditions need to fall by the wayside. You need to do things our way now. And I think one of the strengths of Christianity and why it spread so much and persisted so much, I mean, even just looking at the Catholic Church in Europe, as they slowly kind of toppled these pagan regions, which by like 1000 AD, at least in the West, like paganism as like something people actually practice was pretty much gone. Like that early on in the Middle Ages, like halfway through the Middle Ages, like people in the Western countries, in Christendom, like pagan belief was not really there anymore. It had been kind of sewn into Catholicism. And that idea about the New World, it's kind of the same thing that they were doing in Europe in the Middle Ages too. As the church is expanding and coming into these pagan areas, they're not burning down churches, like or burning down like sites of worship. They're just like, you can still go pray the same place you always prayed and always offered your sacrifices, except now we're going to do mass there. But like everything else is the same. And like, oh, you have your local legends of, you know, your local hero who saved your people from, you know, the monster in the woods. Well, we're just going to make him a saint, and now he's a Catholic saint. So we're just integrating. And of course, Protestants will look at that and be like, the Catholic Church wasn't harsh enough on paganism, and they've rolled in all these practices. What, like, even in the New World, like, oh, they played up the Virgin Mary and Catholics worship Mary, and they shouldn't do these things. And it's like, it in the 2000s and 2010s, like, or even like the 80s and 90s, like evangelical Christianity got a huge push in the United States, and actually now in South America. It's funny you mentioned that as a Catholic stronghold. They're kind of having their own evangelical wave, but I feel like that's not the reason the Catholic Church is a 2,000-year institution is for the reason that they can adapt, whereas I don't see that same thing with evangelical Christianity happening. It seems to have a lot firmer boundaries. I mean, I formerly was part of that world briefly, and it definitely felt like they care a lot more about almost like this strict boundaries of how things should be, which is weird because you would think that would be the Catholic Church, like all the rules and the things you have to do, but it's, I don't know, it's a lot more flexible. I don't know how to describe it. And in the modern world, I feel like you need to be.
It seems like it's a more of a cultural tradition in some ways, because like it's a weird thing where like so my mom's side of the family is Catholic, and I've gone a handful of times, and it's something that's always had a certain draw. Both are like, you know, just because it's kind of foreign but also familiar. And yeah, I'll be very interested to see how it goes. And so it's one of those things like it does. Yeah, I'm not really a Christian currently, but I am very interested in like religion in general. I read a lot about the history of like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, all these different religions, just because I find it really interesting as, you know, if nothing else, like humanity's way of dealing with, you know, you might say divinity, you might say the unknown. Some people might say like, you know, this is just psychological aspects to the human brain. To me, it's almost not an important distinction, but it will be interesting to see. There's been a couple other people I've had on the podcast to talk about this, to see how that evolves, whether or not we see a religious revival in the Western world, which I'm starting to see. I'm wondering if it's going to incorporate aspects of like New Age religion, for example. Like that would be interesting to see, like what the modern saints could be. Because I think interesting in that, like the most recent saint I looked into was like somebody who did like social media stuff.
Yeah, Carlo Acutis.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. Whereas like, you know, it feels like in a strange way, Catholicism has become more resilient because of that. So we'll see how things go in the future.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an interesting trend for sure. And I think there's a tendency from a modern perspective to look at the Middle Ages, which was an extremely religious, like medieval Europe, extremely religious, extremely Christian. I think it would be difficult to wrap our minds around how enmeshed it was in like every part of your life was kind of revolved around the church, revolved around a religious practice, the way you thought about the world. It's important to distinguish that in much the same way that like science now kind of acts as like our baseline, but we're not constantly talking about science. Like you and I are.
Some people are.
Right. Some people are, but like it's not the topic of everyday conversation, but it's kind of like this through line, this common understanding we all have. It was the same thing with medieval religion. But there's this idea that medieval people were so religious because they didn't have scientific understanding, or because and now that we don't need religion anymore because we have science, we don't have as much of the unknown. But I think any scientist in any field worth their salt would tell you that we've barely scratched the surface of discovery in pretty much any field, especially about our natural world. There's still so much we don't understand. But also it's kind of a loop that doesn't make sense if you think about it in medieval history, that medieval people were superstitious because they believed in miracles or were super religious. And they believed in miracles because they were superstitious, and they were superstitious because they believed in miracles. And it becomes like this this loop of like, there has to be another explanation. And the explanation to me is that they were a little bit more in touch with themselves and the world around them than we are, and saw themselves as more of a part of the natural world than we do, and we're more in touch with that. And I think those who are more in touch with the natural world are more willing to identify the presence of a creator and identify forces beyond their control, whereas in the modern sense, we like to think we have control over everything, which I do think it then has downstream effects of anxiety and depression and kind of hopelessness when you realize that that's not true and you don't really know how to deal with that in this modern paradigm, and you're being served a world with no meaning. And so a lot of interesting themes to discuss, but yeah, no, I it is interesting to see this this revival, and I do wonder if it's also I like the idea of death becoming, it's weird. Like, I don't want to go too much on a tangent here. I know we're kind of nearing the end, but
go ahead.
Like, if you think about it, in the medieval world, all the way up until, at least in the United States, all the way up into like the Civil War, death was just was such a part of life in a way that we can't, like, now people go to hospice care, they die in hospitals, there are funeral homes that they take care of the body once the person's dead. There's like a whole cottage industry around death, and it kind of feels almost separated from life in a way. Whereas in the medieval world, for most of human history, generally, like, your loved ones died in your living room. Like, there was no hospital. Well, if somebody got sick, they died in their bed right there, surrounded by everybody. Like, that happened all the way up in the United States. It happened all the way up until the Civil War, when so many people were dying that this cottage industry kind of sprung up around death that we have now with funeral homes and all these things. But all of that to point to the fact that I think closeness to death, like that memento mori, fueled a lot of like medieval religiosity. And I almost wonder if this like I hate to tap too much into current events, but seeing like a young man, like a Charlie Kirk, be publicly executed and have that be all over. So like, to see a 31-year-old killed like that closeness to death, that I think the internet, like even live,
I've seen a lot of people say that it's there's something that did feel uniquely visceral about that. And it's one of those things like, wow, I really I wish I hadn't watched that video. And like you said, with live, like, I grew up in the same era as you on the internet, seeing like horrible things, but there is something that felt like and not to say like, that was a total break, because we, like you said, we're living in an age of a lot of violence right now, with assassinations, attempted assassinations of a president, assassination of that Minnesota state representative. But there was something that did feel like people are really having really, really strong feelings about it. And I feel like you're probably right. That is, I don't know. I can't even think of another contemporary example of somebody who was a social media star, dying on like a live stream, who had that level of profile, which I feel like maybe, and this is maybe a little bit of left field, but like I said, this is what we do in this podcast. Like, I think you're right that, like, to have that connection between the theoretical online world and, wow, this is a real person who died in a horrific and violent way. No matter how you feel about this person's politics, I think you see that people who are like rallying around this person, and people who are using him as like a shibboleth of like, yes, this is, he's an evil person, he got what he deserved. It feels like an order of it feels like a definite difference in something than what we've seen before, for sure.
Yeah, I again, it almost had, not to tie everything back into medieval history, but it almost felt medieval away, especially in the public reaction to it. Almost like you can imagine like two kind of crowds of like medieval villagers screaming at each other, like almost like there's a witch trial going on, and these people say innocent and these people say guilty, and they're about to go at it. And I mean, even just this idea of like the violent kind of public execution of a figure that was known. I mean, that was again part of like living through the turbulent times of the Middle Ages. Like, that was something like your average medieval person would have seen a lot of violence. They would have probably witnessed a murder in their village. They would have seen an execution. They probably, I mean, depending on the time period and where they were living, would have been in war themselves, or have had their village raided, or have witnessed these kind of acts of extreme violence. And I think there was a time period when we sort of, at least in the 20th century, post World War II, a lot of people went through their whole lives without really witnessing that kind of thing. And even now, I think in the US, we still remain shielded from a lot of it, but the internet has made it so we can see it. I think that's another thing that's made like the conflict in Palestine such a major issue, especially for the American youth, is like you can't ignore it.
Yeah,
it's on
it's
your
like
feed.
our Vietnam.
Yeah,
really.
it's on
And
Instagram. It's on. You can see the videos. Like it's the violence is right there. And something like with Charlie Kirk, who, like, definitely not necessarily, his views my cup of tea politically, but always omnipresent on my feed. I feel like for the last 10 years on my Instagram feed, and even like when I was on TikTok briefly, I probably saw that man more than my family. His like clips of him talking to college students. I mean, he was everywhere. It almost felt like you knew him. Like our generation and Gen Z, like he was probably the biggest personality politically. And then to see that, I don't know. I know what you're talking about, that felt uniquely disturbing in a weird way, and uniquely to me medieval.
Yeah, it's I think that's the downside. As we are both more and less connected, we're seeing the uglier aspects of the medieval mindset, so to speak, of because it does feel very pre-rational. It's not about what it's about. There, and it's much in the same way I'm already, and I don't want to make it like a podcast about this, but much in the way I think the medieval mind would try to fill the holes in the lack of understanding with either religion or folklore or whatever. We're seeing that now. And just more broadly speaking too, I see, like, if you see these transhumanist types, it feels like neo-Gnosticism to me. For whatever you want to call it, wokeness feels like a reassertion of public morality and shaming that maybe went away after the boomer era, and we're trying to find a way to reassert these universal social norms and whatnot. And maybe that's, again, maybe because I know we're coming to the end of our time, that's a good way of looking at the value of these ancient times, because we do like to think of ourselves as we're so evolved, we're so different from our ancient ancestors. And if you're looking at the medieval era or reading from the Roman era, or like really good records from like the Han Chinese era, people are people. Even going back to, like, it's a meme at this point, but like An-Nasir, the shifty copper merchant from Mesopotamia, like one of the first written things that we have recorded that's still around as a customer service or complaint. People are people, and we still need something more. And I think a lot of this stuff that we're seeing that we think of as like purely modern psychosis and social norms are things that are perennial, and just reasserting themselves in different ways. And maybe that's the value of some of these more perennial ways of thinking, be it religion or community, whatever it's going to be.
Yeah, I think definitely. And I mean, it's kind of going back to one of the earlier points we discussed, is that the value of studying medieval history is that it is in a weird way like such a mirror for our modern times. And if you think about the way that religion, let's say specifically Catholicism in Western Europe, like permeated the mind and the worldview of people then, in a way, modern, at least in the United States, like modern political thinking has almost reached the level of, like, it is sort of a religion in its own way. It shapes your worldview, it shapes the opinions you have, it's kind of your whole, it hints everything. And in the Middle Ages, like, religious thought created a sense of tribalism and violence against the other and us versus them, and like lack of human understanding in a way. So it's like, again, in my videos, I don't ever want to paint like too rosy of a picture of medieval Catholicism because or the Middle Ages, because obviously there were clear downsides to these ways of thinking. And I think it's so interesting. You'll hear so many people today say like, oh, I'm not religious, I'm not interested in religion. And then they'll like blather at you about their like hardcore political beliefs, and like, these people don't know what they're talking about, but we know what we're talking about. And it's like, that's exactly how the Catholic Church went after heretics. It's the same thing. We'll burn them. We're going to burn those people. And like, they're not human to us, like that sort of thing. I don't know. It's the thinking is very similar. But also, like, how did medieval people deal with these things? How did they live in this like religious paradigm, and what were the good things that came from it that we can learn? And not to think of ourselves again like this linear idea of human history that came about during the Enlightenment of like, we are constantly advancing and progressing. So what's the use of thinking about how our ancestors did things? Like, they were ignorant savages. Like, and I think we need, and I still see that everywhere. I see it on YouTube. We need to divorce ourselves from that way of thinking and bring back a little bit of this medieval living, not crushing heretics, not these things, but communal living, like a sense of meaning, an agreed upon sense of meaning, like morality, these things.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Well, John, I really appreciate you coming on. I know we're coming to the end of our time. Do you have any closing thoughts before you want to do plugs and promotions, or is that
No, I think that was kind of my closing thought. Just the
yeah,
only
well,
plug. The
go
only
ahead.
plug I would have, well, I know this is going live in maybe a month or two, so, but I would assume it would still be there. If you go to ruggedrosaries.com, if you want a rosary as strong as your faith, then go to ruggedrosaries.com and use code mindset for 10% off at checkout. Besides that, please go to my YouTube channel, Medieval Mindset. Go subscribe, go watch my videos, like, comment, engage, push me in the algorithm. I think those are my only plugs.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be sure to share some of your videos leading up to this. So John, I really appreciate your time. This has been a lot of fun. Yeah, you're definitely welcome back if you want to have another discussion. But I always like to end this podcast with the same question I have for every guest. Especially in this week, there's been a lot of doom and gloom. But what is something that makes you feel like, hopeful for the future? What's something you think is good in the world?
Well, actually, I feel like what's happening around me. I think sometimes with the with what the algorithm feeds us, and it can make the world seem like a lot more of a dangerous and violent place than it might seem if you actually walk outside and go around your neighborhood. So I think in the morning, going outside and walking around my neighborhood and saying hi to my neighbors and engaging with my community, I would encourage everybody else to do the same. Not to moralize or really get on my soapbox, but I think that's when you get off of social media and you go interact with other human beings and realize how much you have in common, as opposed to these things that are supposed to be separating us. I feel like that's what gives me hope for the future. That at the end of the day, like you said a couple times, people are people, no matter the era, and you have much more in common with everybody than you think. So that's what gives me hope that that hopefully we're becoming self-aware enough to realize that.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. John, thanks so much for coming on, and everybody go ahead and check him out. He's a really interesting channel. If you're a fan of my content, you'll almost definitely enjoy this.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, bye.